Most computer programs have user configurable options. In this movie, we're going to take a quick look at the options dialog in Revit and some of the settings that you may want to consider modifying on your own systems. I'm in a file called Condo Unit, but it doesn't really matter which file you have open for this. We're not actually going to change the file in any way. We're going to really focus our energy up here on the application menu, the big R in the corner of the screen. And if you open that up and you look way down here toward the bottom, there's an options button right here. And if I click on that, it brings up this multi-tabbed options window, which has many user configurable settings. Now, I'm not going to go through every single setting in here, but I'm just going to highlight a few of the important ones that you might be interested in, or some of the ones that you'd be likely to be curious about right away. And let's start with save reminders. If you've been working with the computer for a while, then you know how important it is to save. In Revit, it is no exception. You need to actually save yourself with the Controls S or the save icon on a regular basis. Revit does not automatically save for you. However, Revit will remind you at a set interval, and that's controlled right here. You can see that the default save reminder interval is 30 minutes. And the way this works is if 30 minutes has passed since the last time you saved, Revit will look for the most inconvenient time to display a dialog and alert you that it's time to save. And they do it disruptively like that on purpose because the idea is to make sure that you remember how important it is to save. So they wait until you execute a command and then they say, oh, but hold on a second, you haven't saved in a while. You can change this increment if you're not happy with 30 minutes. You can go down to 15 or up to 4 hours. I don't recommend turning it off. I think it's a really good idea to keep some sort of save reminder turned on. In a future movie, we're going to talk about the work sharing feature, and that's where the username setting will become important. In addition, the work sharing frequency update and the synchronize with central reminders will also be part of work sharing. So we'll discuss both of those in a future movie as well. The default view discipline is a setting that we can modify, and you can choose which discipline the majority of the work you do is, and that will have an impact on the tabs and template settings that are used for you by default, but you can always choose other options regardless of what you pick here. That's just your default. Under user interface, your tab might vary depending on whether you're using one of the building design suites or whether you're using Revit architecture like I have here. So the exact settings might be a little bit different, but we can do things like change the active theme and how much tooltip assistance. We've been seeing these tooltips appear on screen. Let me show you what some of that looks like. If I highlight a particular command, you see that we get a small tooltip and then a larger one. Here's probably a better example. Here's the wall command. See, I get the small tooltip, and then there's a larger one that includes an illustration. That is the normal tooltip behavior right here where it says normal. If you go to minimal, you only get the small tooltip and it never goes to the larger one. If you go to high, it goes right to the more detailed tooltip and bypasses the minimal one in between. And of course, if you don't want tooltips at all, you can turn them off. I highly recommend either normal or high and read those because it's a great way to learn about each command. You may recall in the contextual ribbon tab movie that we talked about how when you select an object, it would jump over to the Modify tab and show you settings for that object. That's actually controlled by this checkbox right here. So if you don't like that behavior, you can uncheck that and it won't change tabs on you. But I happen to think that it's a good thing to have it change tabs, so I like to leave that setting turned on. Here you get to control some of your default tab behavior as well. When you deselect, do you want it to return to the previous tab or do you want it to stay on the Modify tab, for example? So the Graphics tab is mostly concerned with your video card settings and background colors and your selection colors and so forth. And you can see here that in some cases it will give you a useful message like, I have an older video card driver installed on my system. So it might be a good idea for me to actually go to the manufacturer's website, NVIDIA in this case, and see whether or not they have a more current video driver for me to load. Down here under selection colors, we talked a little bit about the blue color that Revit uses by default in Revit architecture. If you're not happy with that color, you can make changes to it here. You can also change the size of the text that's used on the tooltips and the dimensions on screen, so that can be helpful sometimes to increase that setting. Where Revit accesses resources from is controlled by file locations. So you may recall back on the recent file screen, in addition to open and new, we also had architectural template and construction template. Both of those are listed here. If you want to add a company template, you can click this green plus sign here and add your own company template to the list and make it easily accessible. If you want to change the location where you're saving files or what you're using as the default template, some of those settings are listed here. This course is not going to get into rendering. We actually have a Revit rendering course here at lynda.com, so I recommend that you check that out after you're done with Essentials here, but settings for rendering would be controlled there. Most spell checking settings are pretty self-explanatory, and then steering wheels and view cube are both on-screen navigation tools, and we'll have an opportunity to look at both of those in some of the future movies, but if you don't like some of the default behaviors of either of those two interface items, you can look at changing those here. If you install any macros, any custom programs into your system, you can control the behavior here. So I'm not going to really change any of the settings here, just a quick overview of how some of those settings function. Probably the ones that you'd be most concerned with at an early stage of working in Revit is making sure your save reminders are at a good, useful interval for you, and possibly looking at changing some of your selection colors or your username setting, or looking at that video card. So there's a quick look at the options dialog in Revit.